the early morning of February 3, 2003, a personal driver called 911 saying he thought his boss had shot someone. It took less than 3 minutes for the police to arrive where the driver was waiting. 45 minutes after that, police arrived at the Pyrenees Castle in Alhambra, California, a mansion owned by famed record producer Phil Spector. There, the police found a woman in a chair in the foyer of the house. Her legs stretched out in front of her. She had been shot once in the mouth. The woman would be identified as 40-year-old Lana Clarkson. Lana was a film star who had recently been trying to return to mainstream Hollywood. She had worked in TV and on several movies in her time. Her most notable role was as Barbarian Queen and its sequel. In 2001, Lana had been working to distribute her one-woman show that she'd put so much of her money and effort into. The one-woman show was clips of her acting in different styles and characters, and she'd hoped to escape the typecasting she'd been stuck in for decades. Lana was very interested in her comedic side and wanted to show her actual acting range, that she had more to give than a blonde woman in a bikini. However, she broke both wrists when she fell, slipping on a rug while wearing heels, making it hard to follow up with her show, stalling her career at the time almost entirely. By 2003, she had healed and had started working at the House of Blues as a hostess to make ends meet, hoping that working there she would get noticed by someone. And who was Phil Spector? Born on December 26, 1939, he was a record producer who started his career in 1958 as a founding member of the band The Teddy Bears, where he wrote and performed the hit, "To Know Him Is to Love Him." However, despite its early success, the band was quickly disbanded. In 1960, Spector co-founded Phil's Records. By 1962, he was the sole owner of the record label at 21 years old. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video, making him at the time the youngest label owner. However, the label was defunct by 1969. Over the years, he worked with numerous singers and groups, with so many songs becoming hits like You've Lost That Loving Feeling by The, and he worked with Ike and Tina Turner as well as the Ronettes. He would go on to marry the lead singer of the Ronettes, Ronnie Bennett, in 1968. Shortly after getting married and having some limited success working with Tina Turner, Spector became more of a recluse. He was always known to be a bit odd and to think very highly of himself. After getting married, Ronnie and Phil Spector adopted Dante Philip Spector in 1969. One Christmas, Phil surprised Ronnie with a Christmas present by adopting twins, Louis Philip Spector and Gary Philip Spector. In a 2003 interview, Dante and Gary Spector reported being sexually and psychologically abused by their father. Quote, "For years we were just caged animals to be let out for Dad's amusement." Dante Spector went on to say, "We were locked in our separate rooms by our governess, let out for breakfast, then taken to school by guards." His adopted children have been very private with their personal life. Ronnie and Spector's marriage was said to have significant strains. He was reported to be very controlling. Spector is said to have made Ronnie drive with a blow-up doll in the passenger seat when she wanted to leave the house. He kept her isolated in their home. She never performed on stage while they were married. With the help of her mother, she was able to flee the house. She was allegedly so scared she left without even putting her shoes on. Once free, she was able to file for divorce, which was finalized in 1974, and she gave up custody of the children and the rights to her songs. In 1970, Phil Spector produced the Beatles' Let It Be album, which would be the last album from the band. He also produced John Lennon's hit Imagine. By the mid-1970s, Phil Spector had produced 18 top 10 singles by various artists. He was credited as the man behind the quote, "wall of sound." He was regarded as one of the great men in music. In the 1980s, Spector began dating Janice Zanella. And in 1982, they welcomed twins, Nicole Spector and Philip Spector Jr. Philip Jr. died of leukemia in 1991. For most of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, Spector remained inactive in the music industry. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a non-performer in 1989, reported to have been drunk or under the influence while giving a speech, and was taken off stage by his bodyguards. By 2003, he was known to not give interviews and to be very reclusive. He had reconnected with a friend from high school at a 2002 reunion. Her name was Romy Davis. They had started having dinners together often, and on February 2nd they had dinner at the grill. On this night Phil was drinking, which he had not done in the 5 months that they'd been getting together. This was concerning as Spector took medication that did not mix well with alcohol. Romy Davis said, quote, "He was not his usual self. He was not interested in what I had to say. In all the time I went out with him, he was a great fun to be with. This weekend, the behavior was totally different. He would take Romy home and ask the waitress from the grill to join him for a drink at Trader Vic's. There he would continue to drink. They moved on to Don Tana's and finally the House of Blues, where he would meet Lana Clarkson after the waitress he'd been with previously had gone home, to come back to his home. When she got into his car, that was when the driver drove them to his mansion. A short time later, at around 5 a.m., the driver heard a noise. He got out to investigate, going to the door of the home, finding Spector holding a gun. It was then that he noticed the woman behind Spector. This was when the driver got in the car, drove down the street, and called 911. Spector was arrested on the morning of February 3rd. He and Spector would later say the woman had actually taken her own life in an accident. Police would look into every possibility, but with how the body had been laid and where the gun was found, they believed only Spector could have been the cause of Lana Clarkson's death. Spector was arrested and charged with the murder in second degree. After Spector's arrest, story started surfacing of his relationships with women. These discoveries and used guns to threaten women. One woman, Deborah Robitaille, reported that Spector on more than one occasion had threatened her with a gun to her head, trying to stop her from leaving his house. At least 4 women came forward willingly to testify at his trial that he had threatened them with a gun. It looked like Phil Spector had no respect for women and hated them. While he'd been awaiting trial since 2003, he'd been out on a $1 million bond. While he was awaiting trial, he married Raquel Short in 2006, and she would be seen with Spector at every court hearing. The trial was televised, and Spector treated it like a show. He would show up to court with crazy hair, and the biggest headlines at the time would be about Spector wearing wigs to court. After a while, he started having a more normal hairstyle at court, and he was able to wear, and it would be confirmed later that they were all wigs. His defense would argue that Lana had committed suicide. Philip had been wearing white and he had no blood spatter on his clothes. However, the prosecution would show evidence that Spector had committed the murder and attempted to clean himself up before the police arrived. The blood spatter would not have reached him if he had the gun in Lana's mouth and was above her. There was some controversy about a fingernail that might have been removed from the scene. It was never found and never entered into evidence. Lana had one chipped fingernail that the prosecution believed had chipped when the gun had fired while Lana attempted to remove the gun from her mouth, but was too weak from her wrist injury. The jury would come back hung, 10 in favor of convicting and 2 in favor of acquitting, and the judge would ultimately call a mistrial. Spector could be seen celebrating with his wife after the mistrial. Spector had a second trial in 2008. This time it was not televised. The jury would start deliberations on March 26, 2009, and on April 13th, the jury convicted Phil Spector of second-degree murder, and he was taken immediately into custody. On May 29, 2009, he was sentenced to 19 years to life in prison. Appeals were made in 2011, 2012, and 2016, but they were all unsuccessful. In December 2020, Phil Spector contracted COVID-19, and on January 16th, at the age of 81, Phil Spector died in a hospital. He would have been eligible for parole in 2024. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comments section down below. On November 16, 1999, just after midnight in Charlotte, North Carolina, a woman called Cherika Adams called 911 and reported being shot at. During the 911 call, Cherika told the dispatcher that she had been shot and that she was 8 months pregnant. While talking to dispatchers, she also revealed that the father of her child was in the car in front of her and had slowed down. Then another car came up beside her and shot inside the vehicle. She'd been shot 4 times in a close-range shot pattern through the driver's window. Sharika would name the father of her unborn child as Rae Carruth. Rae Carruth is a former NFL wide receiver. He was a first-round draft pick in the 1997 draft, and the Carolina Panthers picked him up. In his rookie year wearing the number 89, he did well and earned a place on the NFL's all-rookie team in 1997. However, he broke his foot in the opening game in '98 and was out for the rest of the season. He was still actively playing for the Panthers in '99. Sharika Adams was 24, a realtor, and had worked as an exotic dancer until she got pregnant. The club was where she met Rae Carruth, and they had started a sexual relationship. They had not been on a date before she had gotten pregnant. This was one of the first dates they had ever been on. Sharika had always wanted to be a mother, and this was her first child. During the 911 call, Sharika said that Rae Carruth had driven away after the shooting, leaving her alone. It took almost 10 minutes for the dispatchers and medic to find Sharika. After being rushed to the hospital, Sharika went into a coma. The medical staff performed an emergency C-section. The child had been born without oxygen for 70 minutes. The child, a boy, survived, but he was born with cerebral palsy due to complications surrounding his birth. Authorities would quickly tie Rae Carruth to the shooting. Through the investigation into Carruth, they would also get the names of some of the accomplices, 44-year-old Van Brett Watkins and 24-year-old Michael Kennedy. Carruth and Watkins would be arrested Thursday, November 25, 1999, and charged with conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, attempted murder, and shooting into an occupied vehicle. Kennedy would be arrested the next day and charged the same. All 3 men would be held on bail of $1.5 million, but the judge would return at the end of the day and change Carruth's bail to $3 million, $1 million for each charge. A 4th man would be charged, Stanley Abraham, who was 19 years old. Carruth posted bail and was released on December 7th. After almost a month in a coma and having never met her son, Sharika Adams passed away. All men were charged with first-degree murder, which would make all these men eligible for the death penalty. Carruth failed to appear for the resentencing hearing, and the FBI became involved as Carruth was now on the run. They would find him a few days later after a tip came in that he'd been seen in a motel in Wildersville, Tennessee. It was reported that Carruth was there with a woman. When agents searched the motel room, they didn't find Carruth. Agents searched the cars and vehicles in the parking lot and found Carruth in the trunk of a Toyota registered to the woman he was reported to have been with. The FBI agents would report that Carruth was very cooperative with authorities once discovered. After his capture, Carruth had been held without bail awaiting trial. On December 16th, the Carolina Panthers released Carruth citing moral clauses in his contract. The next day, the NFL suspended him indefinitely. Carruth was the first active NFL player to be charged with murder, as O.J. Simpson was not active at the time of his charges. Opening statements of the trial started in November 2000. The official charges were murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, shooting into an occupied vehicle, and using an instrument to destroy an unborn child. Both Michael Kennedy and Van Brett Watkins would testify during the trial. Carruth had been friends with Kennedy for a while, and they were known to hang out frequently, both at his apartment and the house that he got after signing with the Panthers. Watkins met Carruth while working at the club. He would eventually hire Watkins as personal security. Stanley Abraham was friends with Kennedy and had been with him the night that Sharika was shot. It is believed that after discovering that Sharika was pregnant, Rae had asked her to abort the baby as he was already paying $5,000 a month in child support to his high school sweetheart, who had gotten pregnant years before. Sharika refused because she had an abortion and didn't want to have another. He's then alleged to have asked Watkins to beat her up so that it would abort the baby. He refused because he was a hitman, but he didn't beat up women. They apparently went back and forth for months negotiating until Carruth would agree to pay $3,000 up front and $3,000 after to have Sharika killed, who now was almost 8 months pregnant. Initially, he had asked Watkins to kill her while he was away at training camp, so that he would have a solid alibi, but that didn't happen. And it was decided that it would have to be done while Carruth took Sharika out on a date. On November 15th, Carruth would call his friend, Kennedy, and ask if he could borrow a plane vehicle, something without flash. Kennedy was driving a rental at the time and agreed to trade cars. When Kennedy got to the house, Rae asked if he could get a gun, and he said he knew a friend selling a gun. Abraham was with Kennedy at the time. Kennedy would end up taking Watkins and Abraham to buy a gun. Carruth would take Sharika to a movie on their date, and they drove in separate vehicles towards Carruth's house on the way back from the movie. Carruth would call the car with Kennedy, Watkins, and Abraham. When it was time, Carruth slowed down his vehicle, making Sharika slow down. Kennedy was driving the car with Watkins in the passenger seat. Pulling up to Sharika's car, Watkins would fire 4 shots into the driver's window. Leaving the scene, Watkins said that he got out to check if she was dead, then returned to the car. Kennedy then drove away, and after that, Sharika called 911. For testifying, Van Brett Watkins took a plea deal of second-degree murder to take the death penalty off the table and was sentenced to a minimum of 40 years. He will not be eligible for parole until he's 85 years old. Michael Kennedy didn't have the same plea deal when he testified, but would eventually plead guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 11 years and 8 months in prison. He was released in 2011. Abraham would plead to a lesser accessory charge as it was believed he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had no arrest record and was only 19 and spent 90 days in jail in a youth facility before being released on parole. Rae Carruth was found guilty of conspiracy to murder, shooting into an occupied vehicle, and using an instrument to destroy an unborn child. The jury found him not guilty of first-degree murder, stating that he was not the one who pulled the trigger, and this saved him from the chance of the death penalty. Members of the jury had gotten to say that if that had been an option, they would have gone for it. He was sentenced to 18 years and 11 months. Carruth was released from prison in 2018 and moved to Pennsylvania. His son has lived with Sandra Adams, his grandmother, who has now been an advocate against domestic violence since her daughter's death. He recently graduated high school in 2021, a great accomplishment for him. While in prison, Carruth sent a letter to Sandra Adams asking for forgiveness. In an interview before his release, he said he would like to be involved in helping his son financially and to see him if he wanted. There has been no confirmed meeting. Sandra Adams has reported to have forgiven Carruth and even said she was grateful to him for her grandson, saying in a statement, quote, "I'm not going to have anything negative to say about him. I thank him for my grandson. Like I say, you can focus on what you've lost or what you have left. So I didn't lose. I have my grandson. I have my daughter with me in my heart. Always." What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. It was around 5 p.m. on June 17, 2013, when a young man was jogging in an industrial park in North Attleboro, Massachusetts. When suddenly something caught his attention, he investigated further and discovered the body of a young man. The man would later be identified as 27-year-old Odin Lloyd. An autopsy would show that the victim had been fatally shot 6 times. The next day, on June 18th, authorities were able to tie Odin Lloyd to local football legend, 23-year-old Aaron Hernandez. Hernandez was an NFL professional football player who was a 4th-round pick by the New England Patriots in 2010 and played the tight end position. Hernandez was engaged to Sharana Jenkins, and they'd been together since 2007. They welcomed a daughter in 2012 and had lived together since 2011. Sharana Jenkins was how Aaron knew Odin Lloyd. They met at Jenkins' family gathering because Odin Lloyd was dating Shiana's sister Shania Jenkins. The two were reported to have become fast friends. Police would later find surveillance footage of Odin Lloyd getting into a car with Hernandez on the morning of June 17th, with 2 other men later identified and Ernest Wallace. Phone records would show that Hernandez had contacted Wallace the day before the shooting, asking him to come to his house. Police looked into the rental car that had been seen on security camera footage, and they found the vehicle belonged to a local enterprise rental company. They located the vehicle and tested it for prints and checked for additional evidence. After this, Aaron Hernandez was served with a search warrant for his home, and when asked to relinquish his cell phone, he gave them a broken phone. Police also questioned why Hernandez had his house cleaners come on June 17th, the day Odin's body was discovered, and not the normal cleaning day. DNA found at the scene connected Hernandez to the crime scene. A wad of bubblegum was found on one of the shell casings found at the scene. The prosecution was gathering a substantial amount of evidence, all of which pointed to Aaron Hernandez, and charged with first-degree murder. The New England Patriots released him that day from his contract. The New England Patriots would also do an unheard-of jersey exchange in July 2013, offering people the opportunity to exchange their Hernandez jerseys for something else, and hundreds showed up to do so. Police believe that Aaron Hernandez and his friends picked Odin Lloyd up early on June 17th to hang out as they often did. However, Hernandez had other plans. They drove him out to the industrial park, had Lloyd get out of the vehicle before they shot him 6 times, then spat his gum on the ground before driving back to his house, leaving Lloyd there. And a lot of what happened that day is still unknown, as witnesses and Hernandez have not talked about the actual events. The case would move quickly after the arrest of Ortiz and Wallace on June 27, 2013. Initially, they were charged as accessories to murder. However, later they were charged with first-degree murder as well. Walls would go to trial and be acquitted for murder but convicted of being an accessory after the fact. He was sentenced to 4.5 years to 7 years in prison. Ortiz would change his plea to guilty and be convicted of accessory after the fact. He was also sentenced to 4.5 to 7 years. A cousin of Hernandez. They connected her to the crimes via a car that may have been involved in another incident from 2012. Singleton also refused to testify against Hernandez. She was fighting cancer then. She would be indicted on charges of criminal contempt and conspiracy to commit accessory after the fact. She would plead guilty to criminal conduct and be put on probation, having to wear an ankle monitor. It had been reported that she died of cancer in 2015. Hernandez would plead not guilty. His trial would start on January 9, 2015. While awaiting trial, evidence would come up of Hernandez's involvement in a double homicide in Boston. Hernandez would be indicted on the double homicide from Boston in 2014 and would also plead not guilty. In the Odin Lloyd case, he would be found guilty of first-degree murder on April 15th. In Massachusetts, the only sentence for first-degree murder is life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was incarcerated in the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center. However, this was not the end of Aaron Hernandez's legal problems. He would be indicted in a shooting from 2013 of a man named Alexander Bradley, who was a friend of Hernandez. It is believed that he shot him because he was involved with Hernandez in the 2012 double homicide in Boston. Alexander Bradley had been shot in the face, losing an eye, but survived the attack. On April 14, 2017, Hernandez was found not guilty of the double murder. But 5 days later, Aaron Hernandez was found dead, hanging in his cell. He used a bed sheet to commit suicide. At the time, prison officials did not consider him a suicide risk, and he had not been put on round-the-clock watch. After his death, they did an autopsy, and they would find that Hernandez had a severe case, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, also known as CTE, which is a brain condition thought to be linked to repeated head injuries and blows to the head. It slowly gets worse over time and leads to dementia, but the right help with treatment and support can manage the symptoms. It is believed that this may have attributed to his declining mental health and his suicide. After his death, his lawyers filed a motion to vacate his conviction, citing abatement ab initio. Under Massachusetts law, this principle asserts that when a criminal defendant dies but has not exhausted all legal appeals, the case reverts to his status at the beginning. The conviction is vacated. The defendant is rendered innocent. Hernandez had been in the process of appealing the Odin Lloyd conviction. The motion was initially granted in May 2017, where the conviction was later reinstated in 2019 by the Supreme Court, stating that ab initio is outdated. After his death, reports would come out that Hernandez had been secretly gay and had come out to his mother and girlfriend while in jail. An old high school classmate would confirm that they had a relationship during high school. Hernandez was deeply ashamed of his detraction to men. He had been sexually abused as a child by a babysitter for years, and while on prison calls, often went on homophobic rants. His self-hatred got worse with the decline of his mental health. After his incarceration, he also became deeply religious. It was an aspect of his life that he struggled with: the childhood trauma, his sexuality, and his religious beliefs. There have been some speculation on whether Odin Lloyd had found out either about the double homicide or Hernandez hiding his sexuality, and that may have been the motive for the murder. However, it is also revealed that Hernandez abused illicit substances, especially during the off-season, and was prone to bouts of paranoia, mood swings, and violent agitation. We will likely never know what happened that prompted the murder of Odin Lloyd. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comments section down below. It was on June 16, 1980 in Mishawaka, Indiana, when 15-year-old Shelley Warner was abducted in a grocery store parking lot. A witness stated that around 2 p.m., they saw Shelley unload her groceries into her orange Volkswagen Beetle when a young blonde male ran over. They then went on to say that they saw Shelley look surprised but scooted over to the passenger seat, and the male got into the driver's seat and drove the vehicle out of the parking lot. Her car was found hours later at a park-in shop in Osceola, Indiana. The car showed no sign of a struggle and there was no sign of Shelley. Shelley was missing for 10 days before two girls discovered her body in a ravine near an abandoned railroad track. When Shelley had been found, her partially clad body had already badly decomposed, leading law enforcement to believe she'd been murdered shortly after her abduction. An autopsy concluded that she'd been beaten and had died of a gunshot wound to the temple. The medical examiner wasn't able to determine if she'd been sexually assaulted, and no DNA was preserved from the body. No one knew of anyone who would have wanted to hurt Shelley. She was a normal junior in high school. Her mom taught elementary kids, and the murder had seemed completely random. One thing that had always gnawed at detectives: the witness that described Shelley as looking surprised when the man who drove her off got into her vehicle, but she hadn't called out or tried to run away, leading detectives always to believe that she knew her killer or killers. A sketch of the suspect was generated and posted around town, but no one came forward recognizing him. Detectives interviewed over 150 people, but still nothing turned up that could propel the case forward. For 4 decades, the case sat cold. However, in 2022, the Mishawaka Police Department established its first unit devoted to solving cold cases. Shelley's case was reopened and police began to re-interview people who were still alive from the initial investigation. In doing that, they came into contact with a woman who brought previously unknown information to light. Detectives have stated that she gave them 3 names. 3 men that she had direct knowledge had taken part in murdering Shelley Warner. The detectives learned that she only came forward after all the men involved had passed. She had been severely abused by one of the men and had been threatened. Her family was also threatened if she ever came forward. Detectives went on to investigate the 3 men and concluded after multiple witnesses revealed they had a history of violence and the first witness testimony was likely accurate, and have concluded that these men were directly responsible for Shelley's murder. They went on to say that Shelley didn't directly know these men. They were older than she was, but had knowledge of their family members. They're not revealing the motivation for the murder, nor the identities of the men involved at this time. The men died in 2001, 2010, and 2018. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comments section down below. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. It was only a few days before Christmas on December 21st, 1992 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, when 25-year-old Christy Mirack was late for work. Christy was a 6th grade teacher. It was never known to show up past her students, especially without calling someone first. She was known to show up at 8 a.m. every day. She was known to be extremely punctual and stuck to a daily routine. It was one of the final days before Christmas break. She had told her coworkers that she had a special day planned for the students, which was all the more concerning that she wasn't there. Running late was one thing, but missing the first bell was very unlikely for Christy. The teachers at Roarstown Elementary were all close. Her friend and principal, Harry Goodman, decided that it would be best if he went over and checked on Christy at her home since the other teachers had students to watch over. He made the short drive over and immediately knew something was amiss. Her car was still parked out front. And then he saw that the front door to Christy's townhome was left open. As he got closer, he could see into the entryway of the home and saw Christmas presents carefully wrapped were strewn about, and as he drew nearer, he saw Christy's body lifeless between the entryway and the living room. He ran over to a neighbor's home to call 911. When first responders arrived, Christy was cold to the touch, and she was declared deceased at the scene. An autopsy later revealed that her cause of death was strangulation. She had extensive defensive injuries, including a broken jaw, bruises all over her, and a tooth that had been knocked out. She had bruises on her neck, showing that someone had tried to strangle her manually, but also used a sweater as a ligature. Christy was also sexually assaulted. At the crime scene, officers found scuff marks just outside Christy's front door, pinpointing to a likely point of access for the attacker. It appeared that Christy had just been walking out the door when her attacker forced their way into her home. She was still wearing her gloves, her purse was found nearby, and a bag filled with Christmas presents meant for each of her students were all found close to her body. But it was only a short shriek. Afterwards, it was silent, so they didn't call law enforcement. Christy's roommate had left at 7 a.m., so they believed it was a targeted attack, with someone surveilling Christy's home and learning her schedule. They also reported seeing a man running in the direction of Christy's townhome. He had come out of a white car parked nearby. They described the man as Caucasian, athletic build in his 20s, with sandy blonde or light brown hair, cut short. Christy was known to be a stickler for home security. She was always known to keep her home and car locked at all times. It was something she and her roommate had different opinions on. Her roommate wasn't certain she locked the door when she left for work that morning. Law enforcement interviewed Christy's friends and family. Christy and a group of her friends had gone to a club that weekend. Law enforcement had found a ticket stub in her wallet for the club. None of her friends knew of anyone who may have wanted to harm Christy, but revealed she had recently broken up with a boyfriend who they only knew as Dagger. Dagger was located and he had a strong alibi. He had been in another state with his wife. Christy hadn't known he was married and had recently ended the relationship when she realized he wasn't going to propose. His DNA was also collected, which didn't match the sample from the killer. Harry Goodman was also investigated, as detectives found it suspicious that he'd been the one to go over to her home that morning, finding his interest in the young teacher concerning. But he was also eliminated both by alibi and DNA. Investigators even looked into the possibility it had been a hired hit. However, that trail ended nowhere. The more likely scenario was of a spurned suitor or stalker, though no one knew of anyone who that could be, nor had Christy made any mention of being harassed. The vehicle seen the morning of the murder was described as a white or light gray 1987 to 1991 Dodge Daytona hatchback. They said that the car had started appearing up to 2 weeks before the murder and hadn't been seen since. The car hadn't been well kept. It was noted as dirty, faded, and dull. A police sketch was done of the man seen that morning and distributed, but no one was identified as a match. Despite an exhaustive investigation, eventually the leads ran dry and the case went cold. In 2016, the case was reopened and the DNA from the crime scene was resubmitted for further genetic analysis. Parabon Nanolabs created this composite image of what the murderer might have looked like based on his DNA. It was also at this point that the suspect was identified as having a mix of Latin and European descent, which might have differed from the original sketch of the suspect. The DNA was uploaded to state and national databases, but neither came up with any leads. In 2019, the case was again re-examined, and this time Parabon was asked to run genetic genealogy analysis on the DNA. And there they found genetic relatives of the suspect, allowing them to begin to piece together a family tree, making it very likely a suspect could be identified. Raymond Charles Howe was the most likely suspect. He was working as a wedding DJ in Lancaster, Pennsylvania at the time of the murder. He was 23 years old and had worked at several nightclubs in 1992 as a DJ. He had even worked at the club that Christy had gone to the Saturday before her murder. Christy's home had been between his home and place of work, giving him further opportunity to stalk Christy. She may have rejected him at some point, and he could have either followed her home or saw her outside while he was heading home. Police surveilled the now 50-year-old DJ and saw him throw away a water bottle and chewing gum. Both items were retrieved by detectives and tested for DNA, and it was a match. After 3 decades, Howe was arrested and charged with criminal homicide, 3 charges of sexual assault, and 2 counts of involuntary deviant assault. There was no trial for Howe as he pleaded guilty to the charges, and he was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility for parole plus an additional 120 years. However, this case has recently been in the news because Howe's legal team has made several appeals. Drawn his guilty plea, he went on to say that he and Christy had a consensual encounter the morning of her murder, but he had left her alive and well and is alleging that someone else killed her that morning. He wanted several items in the home retested to prove another suspect was in the home. His legal team stated that he should have a trial, allowing his legal team the opportunity to retest the DNA evidence. In November 2022, the appeal was denied. The judge who presided over the decision said that adequate DNA technology and preservation practices were available in 1992, and therefore it is unlikely to yield different results. In her judgment, she made the statement, quote, "Obviously, we think this is the correct legal decision and hope it provides some measure of relief for the family, but this is likely just the beginning of what can be a lengthy appellate process. Will need to be filed with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court." Christy Mirack's mother passed before ever seeing justice for her daughter's murder, but it had been her dying wish for there to be justice. Christy's brother thanked the media for keeping the case alive, and Lancaster Police Department for continuing to seek justice. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below. It would become Spokane, Washington's oldest cold case, the brutal murder of 9-year-old Candy Rogers, who was abducted while going door-to-door selling Campfire Girl mints. Candy Rogers disappeared on March 6, 1959. The 4th grader who attended Holmes Elementary School was described as small for her age, but had a determined mindset. She had recently joined the Campfire Girls, a youth organization focused on outdoor activities. She was a bluebird and was working towards ranking up in the organization. So that afternoon she came home, played with her dog, ate an oatmeal cookie, and set out carrying a bag of boxed mints to go door to door to sell them in the neighborhood. She was only meant to be out for an hour or so. She was to be home for supper but never ran back through the door. When it was dark, her grandparents and mother started to look for her. As they searched and saw no sign, the police were called, who joined in the search along with neighbors. At 9 p.m. someone found several boxes of mints strewn along the road. The Campfire mints were believed to have been the same ones Candy had been selling, and Candy had been kidnapped. 4 days the search continued with Marines, the Air Force, the military, and residents searching on foot and by horseback. An exhaustive search was undertaken by over 1,200 people and ultimately ended 16 days later when her body was discovered in a wooded area covered in tree branches and pine needles 7 miles from her home. An autopsy was done which showed Candy had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled with an item of her clothing. It had been a horrific attack that shocked the community. Hundreds of tips began to flood in and hundreds of people were interviewed, but nothing closed the case. Spokane Police Department honed in on a suspect, a killer who lived nearby, Hugh B. Morse. He was already serving a life sentence for murder but denied killing Candy Rogers. He had been the strongest suspect, however decades later he would be eliminated with DNA evidence. As the years passed, the case would be passed down from detective to detective, ultimately becoming the oldest cold case in the Spokane Police Department. In 2021, evidence in the case was re-examined for DNA evidence and forensic genealogy. Samples were recovered and eventually they found a family tree with 3 brothers that closely matched the unknown suspect. Law enforcement reached out to some of the living relatives, which ultimately led them to the daughter of one of the brothers. DNA from her was a paternal match, but to be certain her father was the correct person, they opted to exhume the grave of her father, John Ray Hoff. The DNA was an exact match. Hoff was 20 at the time of the murder and lived a mile from Candy in 1959. There had been a small connection between the two. Hoff's younger stepsister was a little older than Candy and had also been in the Campfire Girls Club that Candy had been in. Hoff had been in the military, serving in Korea, but was dishonorably discharged when he was arrested and convicted for the assault with intent to rob in 1961. In that case, he had abducted, strangled, and assaulted a woman, but she had survived the attack. He only served 6 months in prison for that conviction. After his prison release, he worked odd jobs, he got married and had children. The same age Candy was when she'd been murdered, he committed suicide. At the time of his death, his family believed he had depression or PTSD from his time in the military, but he may have killed himself for a more sinister reason, relieving the world of a serial predator. His daughter, now in her 60s, has fully cooperated with law enforcement to help close Candy's murder investigation. She apologized on behalf of her family in a statement to the media. Candy's surviving relative, a cousin, thanked Spokane PD for continuing to work on a cold case she never thought she would live to see closed, even after 6 decades. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comments section down below. There isn't a lot of information publicly available, but this is what we know so far. It was on April 21, 1995 when human remains were discovered in a ditch in Carbon, Alberta, Canada. The remains were significantly decomposed with estimations that she'd been deceased for 10 to 15 years, putting her time of death to be sometime in the early to mid-1980s. Carbon is a very small community in rural Alberta, with the closest city being Drummiller. The community is primarily farming and ranching with a population of less than 500 people, which may explain why her body was never found for so long. A forensic expert examined the remains and concluded that Compton Jane Doe was 20 to 35 years of age at the time of her death. She was between 5 foot and 5'4". She had multiple stainless steel crowns as well as fillings, so she had undergone extensive dental work throughout her life. They believe she was mixed race with North African or indigenous ancestry, though they believe she wasn't from Canada because she had contracted brucellosis at some point in her life, which would have caused her to have a debilitating disease impacting her life. Brucellosis would have compromised her immune system, giving her joint pain, fatigue, and frequent fevers. Brucellosis isn't an infectious disease found commonly in Canada. It comes from consuming animal products from infected cattle, goats, and pigs. However, some have pointed out that Compton Doe could have been in a residential school at some point in her life, as it was common for children to get sick from brucellosis there from unpasteurized milk given to children from sick animals. Compton Doe doesn't match any missing persons cases in Canada, but if she had been put into a residential school, her family may not know or have been able, also based on her bone structure. They believe she may have given birth at least once in her life. A cause of death could not be determined due to the integrity of the remains. She was found without clothing or any personal items. Maybe she had none to begin with or simply had disappeared throughout time. It's too hard to tell. In 2019, a clay reconstruction was done to show what she may have looked like. In the province of Alberta, and they hope that even after nearly 4 decades, someone might recognize her. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comments section down below. On September 13, 1975, residents of Compton, California were met with a disturbing discovery. Just off the 700 block of West Artesia Boulevard and Wilmington Avenue, the body of a nude black teenager had been found dumped at the side of the road. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department were called to the scene and immediately determined that she'd been shot twice in the head. Her body would also tell another shocking story. Investigators determined that she'd likely been thrown from a moving vehicle, which proved to be the fatal injury, not the 2 shots to the head. The area in which she was found was an industrial area, and there were few witnesses. The Los Angeles County coroner, who performed the autopsy, commented that the girl was black between the ages of 14 and 17, 4 feet 11 inches and 5 feet 2 inches, and 90 to 110 pounds. She'd been deceased just hours prior to her discovery, giving them a strong hope of identifying her quickly. Jane Doe is described as having short, curly black hair, brown eyes, and 1 to a 1.5 inch scar on the instep of her left foot. She was found nude but was wearing the following jewelry: a gold ring with a large black stone that contained a smaller gold flower, a silver or white gold ring with 1 white stone and 6 green stones, a gold bracelet, a white gold or silver bracelet, and a white gold or silver keychain necklace. Despite her being found nude, there was no signs of sexual assault, and according to the Doe network, all toxicology screenings came back negative for alcohol and other substances. Several months passed, and despite a few appeals, nobody came forward to claim her. Unfortunately, Jane Doe, or Jane Doe 51, has received little to no media attention, unlike other Jane Does in California and beyond. Shortly after her discovery, she was cremated, and DNA, dental, and fingerprint samples were taken for reference. The NCMEC and NAMAS have created approximation sketches of what she may have looked like in life. What are your thoughts about this case? Let us know in the comment section down below.